Hello, welcome to the Coffee Conversation hosted by the Hugh Lane Gallery on the 2nd of June 2021. My name is Aoife and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to our discussion on Natura Morta by German artist Karl Schmidt-Rottluff. Karl Schmidt-Rottluff was a German painter and printmaker, one of the key figures in German expressionist art, as well as a founding and leading member of Die Brücke, the artist group. German expressionism, like a lot of European art at the beginning of the 20th century, was moving towards a type of art that confronted reality. The German expressionists sought to create a new art that was unburdened by tradition and history. It was forceful, it was violent, and it was striking. Schmidt-Rottluff created art that was shocking in its vibrancy and its harsh, angular use of line. Drawing inspiration from Gothic art, graphic works by Vincent van Gogh, Paul Gauguin, and the work of the Pont-Aven community in France, as well as international art, such as African art and oceanic art. The German expressionists and Schmidt-Rottluff helped to revolutionize art in Germany and produce a work that is as powerful today as it was in the 1900s. Sadly, many of the German expressionists suffered at the hands of the Nazi Party in Germany. Karl Schmidt-Rottluff in particular had his work labeled as degenerate and confiscated or destroyed. In spite of this, after the war, Schmidt-Rottluff was able to return to creating his work, and it is from this time, after decades of experimentation and trial and error, that we see all of his ideas, all of his most fervent passions brought together in this simple watercolor still life, Natura Morta. Karl Schmidt-Rottluff was born on the 1st of December 1884 in Rottluff, a district of what is now Cubist in Saxony. The third of 7 children, he was a son of a mill foreman, August Schmidt, and his wife Auguste Marie. Originally going by simply Karl Schmidt, he adopted the name Rottluff from about 1906 onwards. He attended grammar school, where he became a founding member of the school's Vulcan Club, which staged plays, readings, and exhibitions. And it was here that he befriended Erich Heckel, who would become a lifelong friend and fellow founding member of Die Brücke. Schmidt-Rottluff began to make his art from about 1901, working primarily in watercolors, studies in oil, and woodcuts. By 1904, he had even begun to exhibit his watercolor landscapes at the Locus Kunsthaus in Chemnitz. In 1905, he began to study architecture at the Sächsische Technische Hochschule, or the Saxon Technical College, in Dresden alongside Erich Heckel. There, Heckel introduced him to another student, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, and Kirchner's friend Fritz Bale. All 4 of these young men sketched and painted together and felt they had similar artistic aspirations, all as they were all using their architectural studies as a means by which they could teach themselves to become painters. On June 7th, 1905, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Karl Schmidt-Rottluff, Erich Heckel, and Fritz Bale formed Die Brücke, an artist group that aimed to create a lively, vital art that renounced previous artistic traditions. The name Die Brücke was suggested by Karl by Karl Schmidt-Rottluff, derived from a quotation from Nietzsche's Also sprach Zarathustra from 1883. According to his friend Haeckel, it is a very versatile word. It wouldn't predetermine anything, but rather would take us from one side to another, as it were. In German, Brug means bridge, and it's possible this was intended to convey the idea of a bridge between artists and society at large. Members of Die Brücke were committed to look at the idea of original creativity. Part of their ethos was rejecting the academy's formal instruction and instead embracing a communal studio and open exchange of ideas. The group's manifesto in 1906 declared that we achieve freedom of life and action against the well-established older forces. The first exhibition of the group was in 1906 in the showroom of the Karl Marx Seifert lamp factory, but they showed as a group at least 70 times between 1905 and 1913. The young artists of Die Brücke were averse to anything classical and instead sought interest in the archaic or the primitive. Their art involved elements of old German art, as well as new types of art available to them, such as African and Oceanic Pacific art, as well as the influences of post-impressionist and Fauvist art, all coming together to create a very unique style. In November 1905, the Gallery Arnauld in Dresden showed its first exhibition of works by Vincent van Gogh. And the year after, it showed works by French neo-impressionists such as Signet, Seurat, and Gauguin. These exhibitions left a lasting impact on the artists of Die Brücke and helped them to develop their own independent painting styles. Die Brücke recruited members who were patrons of the arts, not just artists themselves, into its group. These passive members of the Brücke paid a subscription fee annually, which entitled them to a portfolio of prints made by the artist every year, the first of which was published in 1906. Schmidt-Rottluff, who we can see in his self-portrait here, was a key figure in the group's development of prints. As well as being secretary of the group, he introduced the group to lithography, as well as a main force behind the group's first exhibition of woodcut prints. In spite of this, Karl Schmidt-Rottluff was something of a loner, and he was less active in the group than other members. In the summer of 1906, Karl Schmidt-Rottluff spent several weeks with Emil Nolde and his wife Ada on the island of Elsan. During that time, experimenting with pure colorism, Schmidt-Rottluff began learning the expressive power of art rooted in instantaneous and intuitive responses driven by raw emotion. As a result, he invited Emil Nolde to join Die Brücke as an active member in 1906, which he did for a period of time. After this visit to Elsan, Karl Schmidt-Rottluff developed a love of the versatility of nature. This is part of the reason why the following year he moved from Dresden to Oldenburg. Around this time, and by exploring nature, he began to really express independent works, very unique and separate from his fellow artists of Die Brücke, who were still working in Dresden. He would spend the summers between 1907 and 1912 on the North Sea near Oldenburg, in places like Dangast then Gast, where he was sometimes joined by his friends Erich Heckel and Max Perstein. Karl Schmidt-Rottluff's work stood out from his colleagues due to his balance of composition and simplification of form, all of which served to exaggerate the flatness of the plane in an extreme way. His subject matter is not typical of the work of the members of Die Brücke, who typically painted urban modernity. He instead preferred to create landscapes, many of which he created during the summer months spent in the fishing village of Dangast and along the Baltic Sea coasts of Niden and Hoach. He also depicted nudes and hence quite radically stylized that were often influenced by Cubism, African art, and oceanic art. From about 1910, Schmidt-Rottluff created landscapes and figurative paintings that were much more simplified and lacking detail, often limited to a few complementary colors. Estate in Dangast is from 1910 is one of his most powerful landscapes. It is a wonderful example of the relationship to color that Schmidt-Rottluff was developing at this time. It is very untraditional, and the color strikes the viewer as an almost elemental force. The work of the estate in Dangast reflects this very critical phase in Schmidt-Rottluff's development, in which the image is made up of color value and color form. The intensity of the color in this image is not a realistic depiction of the coast along the North Sea. Similarly, the artist is not trying to depict the work as true to life. Instead, the color has become the principal element of the work. Historian Paul Vogt has said about this piece, nuances or graduated tonal values simply do not exist. No color is too brilliant, no contrast too harsh to be used. Schmidt-Rottluff also uses the colors to create a type of spatial tension within the work, wherein the warmth of the red seems to push forward towards the viewer, while the depth of the blue seems to recede into the depths of the work. In 1912, Schmidt-Rottluff took a greater interest in Cubism than other members of Die Brücke. He tried to use the new ideas coming out of France and use the ideas of the simplification of Cubist paintings as a way to express himself better in his own work. The process of abstraction first appears in Schmidt-Rottluff's landscapes in 1912 and would have had significant impact on his work in the following years. In 1912, he was exposed to an exhibition of works by Picasso, which left this strong influence upon him that is visible in his work from this time period. That same year, in 1912, he would produce a small group of pictures that were some of the most significant of his landscapes, as can be seen here in House and Trees, which condenses both nature and architecture into light, color, and basic form in an almost abstract manner. Die Brücke aimed to close the division between artist, printer, dealer, and publisher by printing and publishing their own prints and using their prints to market their ideas and finance their works. They published 7 portfolios of prints between 1906 and 1912, with the number of portfolios issued varying depending on the number of passive members Die Brücke had at the time. They also designed and very often hand-printed a variety of ephemera, such as programs, letterheads, exhibition catalogs, posters, a lot of which still survive. Die Brücke was equally devoted to graphic work as it was to painting, particularly to the art of woodcuts. One of the aims of Die Brücke, as I mentioned, was to distance themselves from academic tradition and modern urban life to develop what they saw as an authentic art. The use of woodcuts was central to this idea, as they gave the artist freedom to create rough works in a primitive style, as well as freedom from the conventions and traditions of fine art. Germany had a rich tradition of woodcuts, so the use of woodcuts was seen as creating a connection between the members of Die Brücke and the German artists of the past, such as Albrecht Dürer. Contemporary artists of the time, such as Gauguin and Munch, provide examples of what could be achieved and how expression could be portrayed through the art of carved wood. Woodcut engravings always played an important role in Schmidt-Rottluff's work, and he was instrumental to introducing the woodcut as a medium in the group from as early as 1909. It was through woodcut that he was first tested out the interplay of highly contrasting surfaces and how effective contours and lines could be at creating tension within an image. From 1911 onwards, he experimented with reduced and simplified forms, influenced by so-called primitive art. Over time, his style became much more abstract and stylized, producing harder and more angular edges to his woodcuts. Before 1912, he typically printed his works by hand in small numbers, but over time, he began to use professional printers, sometimes working on commissions from publishers. Over the course of his entire career, Karl Schmidt-Rottluff made 663 printed images, a mix of woodcut, etching, and lithograph. Of these, nearly 450 of them were woodcuts, and most date from between 1905 and 1920. The Brücke slowly dissolved as the years went on, as the members, including Schmidt-Rottluff, moved to Berlin in 1911. The group ultimately ended in 1913, with each of the artists moving away from the strict principles that had at one point united their works stylistically. Schmidt-Rottluff instead began to gather a circle of friends and patrons and collectors, and he had his first solo show in the Gallery Commente, even as war loomed on the horizon. In May 1915, Karl Schmidt-Rottluff was conscripted to the war, and he served for 3 years as a soldier on the Eastern Front, stationed in Lithuania and Russia. In October 1916, Schmidt-Rottluff was transferred from the supply battalion in Lithuania to the press office of the military headquarters in Nauno, which was at the time part of Russia. There he discovered that the trauma he had experienced and shattered nerves had left him unable to paint, and instead he worked primarily with wood for several years. During the First World War, he turned to sculpture, making about 12 of these wood carvings inspired by African sculptures, most of which were heads, some painted in bright colors like red, blue, or green. He frequently made woodcuts during this period, as he found the carving process of the woodcuts acted as a sort of therapy for his anxiety and shattered nerves caused by his military experiences. During the war, he sought spiritual solace in the face of his trauma, and so he began to incorporate religious themes into his work for the first time in his life. For him, themes of salvation and redemption and images from the Bible came very naturally. In 1918, he created a series of 9 woodcuts based on the life of Jesus Christ that he entitled Nine Holzschnitt, but subsequently became known as the Christ Portfolio. After the First World War, he returned to Berlin and began once more to paint in oils. The post-war works he produced are in many ways reminiscent of his works before the First World War. And you can see in this work here of his wife, Emmy, who he married in 1919. Emmy Frisch was a photographer, and after marrying Schmidt-Rottluff, her and her husband regularly spent the summer months in the small fishing village of Jurshoft in Pomerania near the Baltic coasts, often using the laborers and farmers as motifs in paintings, as can be seen in this work as Leitsfuder. In 1918, the Arbeitsrat für Kunst, or Council for Art, was formed in Berlin, led by architects Walter Gropius and Adolf Benn. It was a union for artists, sculptors, and architects, and saw itself as an anti-academic movement in Germany at a time of revolution. 4 members of Die Brücke joined the council, including Schmidt-Rottluff. There he befriended Walter Gropius, who tried in vain to convince him to become a teacher at the Bauhaus. Schmidt-Rottluff's style of painting developed throughout the decade. In the early 1920s, his angular, quite graphic style became more freer and fluid, becoming that bit more colorful, so that by the mid-20s, he evolved into a new style with flat shapes and somewhat more gentle outlines. One of Schmidt-Rottluff's biggest supporters was Dr. Rosa Shapir. She was an art historian who was one of the first supporters of the Brücke and had been a close friend of Schmidt-Rottluff since 1908. In 1901, he created for her a decorative scheme for the living room of her apartment in Hamburg. He designed a table, had stools covered, and creating other furniture, as well as making carpets, cushions, and tablecloths, all tied together by sculptures and paintings by the artist himself. The paintings and sculptures have survived, having traveled with Dr. Shapir to England before the outbreak of the Second World War, but the furniture had to be left behind in Hamburg, where it was sadly destroyed in an air raid. The Schmidt-Rottluff couple made their first trip to Italy in 1923, and from 1927 to 29, they regularly visited Ticino in Switzerland. In 1932, Hannah Brücke-Vollrath, the gallery owner and collector, invited Schmidt-Rottluff to her Blue House outside of Frankfurt. The Blue House was a meeting point for contemporary artists, and it would end up becoming a second home for Schmidt-Rottluff until the end of his life. He received the great honor of being made a member of the Prussia Akademie der Kunst, or the Prussian Academy of Arts, in 1931. Sadly, however, this would not last. The honors that were given to Schmidt-Rottluff after the First World War, when Expressionism was officially recognized in Germany, were stripped from him during the rise to power of the Nazis. The rise of Nazism and the Second World War brought an end to the period of great productivity of the Expressionist movement. Degenerate art was a term used by the Nazi Party from the 1920s onwards. It referred to art that did not fall into line with the art policies of National Socialism, with much of Germany's avant-garde works being labeled as degenerate. In the Nazi state, art's only task was to illustrate the ideas of National Socialism and to glorify the state. In 1933, Karl Schmidt-Rottluff and his art were denounced as degenerate by the Nazi state. That same year, he was expelled from the Prussian Academy of Arts. In 1937, the wide-scale confiscation of all works viewed as degenerate began. According to records, 15,997 works of fine art were confiscated from 101 German museums, including 608 works by Karl Schmidt-Rottluff, many of which were destroyed. In March 1939, the propaganda ministry had between 4,000 to 5,000 artworks burned in the courtyard of the Berlin Fire Department. The Degenerate Art exhibition, held in Munich in 1937, displayed many of Schmidt-Rottluff's confiscated works, including a series of his woodcuts, showing them to the public to ridicule, demonizing and emphasizing the monstrosity of the works he had created over his lifetime. As a final insult, in 1941, Karl Schmidt-Rottluff was excluded from the Reich Chamber of Fine Arts and was prohibited from painting at all. To add to the tragedy, in 1943, a bomb strike resulted in the destruction of the studio and home of Schmidt-Rottluff in Berlin, resulting in much of his work being lost forever. He and his wife Emmy set out to travel to his family's home in Chemnitz, where he lived until the end of 1946. Thankfully, Dr. Rosa Shapiro fled to England in 1939 to escape Nazi persecution, bringing with her her collection of Schmidt-Rottluff's paintings and sculptures and prints, as well as roughly 200 painted postcards, letters from Schmidt-Rottluff, Heckel Kirchner, and other artists within the German Expressionist circle. Fortunately, after the war, Schmidt-Rottluff began to recover his reputation. In 1946, he took a job as a professor at Berlin's Hochschule für Blinde Kunst, and he moved back to what was now West Berlin. He there became an important influence on the new generation of artists. He continued teaching there until 1954, while also recommencing his travel to places along the Baltic Sea. In 1952, he became the second chairman of the Deutscher Künstlerbund and won the Art Prize for the city of Berlin. He was also awarded the Ordre pour le Mérite Peace Prize. Natura Morta is Italian for still life, And this is one of a large number of still lifes created by Karl Schmidt-Rottluff in the 1940s and 50s. Though the subject matter is simple and straightforward, the still life combines so many of the ideas he had been experimenting with and exploring from his time in Die Brücke through his experiences in the First World War and after. The still life is dominated by the large white leaves of the caladium potted in a terracotta pot. Besides the plant is a gourd-shaped vase or jug with diamond-shaped decorative motifs. In front of it, in the foreground, there is a small carved head ornament. The head is carved in a simplistic and expressive manner, suggesting it is likely one of the pieces of African or oceanic art that the artist had collected over decades. Between the main objects, mostly painted in greens and browns, we have in the background a sharp contrast with the brilliant blues, reds, and yellows of the backdrop behind it. This still life likely dates from the 1950s, and as it is one of several still lifes he made in watercolors around that time. The vase in the work appears in another work from 1954, now in the Museum Vogtwang in Essen. So it is likely that these objects were around his home and he painted them repeatedly. Karl Schmidt-Rottluff was fascinated by African and oceanic art for decades and was greatly influenced by the artworks he saw in the Ethnographic Museum in Dresden in the 1900s. At the Dresden Ethnographic Museum, objects from the Palau Islands and other German colonies were displayed, exposing him as a young artist to these pieces so very different from European fine art. We can see this influence from early on, how he deliberately uses jagged lines in his woodcuts, coarsening his edges, adding extra texture to his prints. And from 1930 and onwards, Schmidt-Rottluff had collected objects of non-European art, which he depicted in his still lives throughout the years. Almost all of Schmidt-Rottluff's still lives in this time feature these objects of African or oceanic primitive art, items that would have been considered exotic or unusual, as well as noteworthy in a still life. The historian Paul Vogt argues that watercolor was the purest rendering of the spiritual essence of the time. And he notes how quick drawing a watercolor, how quick it is, how fleeting, unlike painting or graphic work, which requires more time and strenuous effort. Schmidt-Rottluff typically outlined the objects and things he depicted in nature, and Natura Morta is no exception. The line work is fluid and simple. It doesn't dwell on the fine details, instead giving a rough impression of texture, color, and form. The artists use pools of thick watercolor to create a sense of depth in spaces, particularly in the decoration of the vase and in the shadows behind the potted plant. In spite of his very smooth line work throughout much of the piece, the caladium plant is painted with an almost dry brush technique, giving across a better sense of the variegation of color found within its broad leaves. In 1964, Karl Schmidt-Rottluff gave up oil painting after 6 decades for health reasons. But that same year, a major retrospective of his work was held in a traveling show in Hanover, Essen, Frankfurt, and Berlin to mark his 80th birthday. In the 1960s then, he worked to bring about the creation of the Brücke Museum in West Berlin. He donated 75 of his works to the state of Berlin in 1964, which became the basis of the collection of the New Brücke Museum, a repository for works from the former members of Die Brücke. Schmidt-Rottluff continuously acquired works for the collection, seeking to expand it, and it was finally able to open in 1967 and remains in Berlin to this day. Schmidt-Rottluff's wife Emmy died in 1975, the same year the Karl Schmidt-Rottluff Sponsorship Foundation was launched, which twice annually awarded bursaries to young artists. Finally, Karl Schmidt-Rottluff himself passed away at age 91 on the 10th of August, 1976 in Berlin. In spite of a lifetime of struggle and strife, Karl Schmidt-Rottluff managed to create art that broke new ground and led the way for entirely new types of expressionist and modernist art. His fascination with the world can be seen in his works, from his most experimental oil paintings to his simplest watercolors. The simple beauty and vibrancy of Natura Morta reminds us why more than 100 years after he helped to found Die Brücke, Karl Schmidt-Rottluff is still admired across the world. I'd like to thank you all for joining our discussion today. For further details about our upcoming programs, please see our website, and I hope to see you again in the future.